I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. Welcome to the Wayward Wizards podcast. I'm Zach.
And I'm Logan.
And this week we are reading Book 1, Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past. So, yes. Logan, what happens this week?
I think last week you said the changing of the tone. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. So, Frodo settles into Bag End. He sort of gets used to, doing his own thing with Bilbo off on his adventure, and then Gandalf comes. We pretty quickly get confirmation that the ring is indeed the One Ring, and we get a bunch of ring lore around that. How did the ring come to Frodo? And then we get an exploration of who, Smeagol / Gollum is. And finally, some preliminary plans about leaving the Shire. And just an admonition, whatever you do, keep it secret, the ring, don't use it. And then Gandalf is off, and we start to get some plot.
We get some plot. We get some great exposition.
Yeah.
About the formation of the Rings of Power, and the final proof that this is the Great Ring, the One Ring.
Yep.
So we start out with a little bit of good old fashioned Hobbit gossip.
Right.
At the Green Dragon. Last chapter we had the gossip from kind of the elder generation. You had the miller, and you had the gaffer talking at the ivy bush. Yep. But it seems like the younger hobbits have their own local haunt that they really like, called the Green Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And we find out some interesting things. There's stirrings going on in the world, and there's movements of people that usually don't make their way into the Shire. You get some dwarves who are fleeing. It seems like a war that's brewing in the land of Mordor. It's the first instance that we get of Mordor in the book, and we find out that the evil power that had been in Mirkwood, that kind of lingered in the story of the Hobbit, has reconstituted itself, is drawing up power, that the Dark Tower has been rebuilt, and that war is brewing across the land, and elves are moving, dwarves are moving, and even some stranger things like giants have been seen on the edge of the Shire.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even the hobbits who, sort of have choose sort of an ignorance about the outside world, are getting this news, kind of whether they like it or not.
Yeah.
The miller, I'm just blanked on his name. It's right here in front of me.
Ted
Sandyman. Sandyman represents, I think, the hobbits who, even given the kind of stories that they're hearing, are still kind of obstinately, claiming that this stuff is nonsense. And that's sort of the back and forth that we get with Sam and Sandyman. And Sam really represents a different kind of hobbit who kind of goes in for these romantic stories and stories of the outside world.
Yeah, Sam is different than the other rustic hobbits.
Right.
Even though he's
Yes.
part of that social class, that working class hobbit, he is excited by these stories, and he senses that something is about to happen.
Yeah. Part of the back and forth is that Sandyman is dismissing um, these stories, old stories, as well as um, the new kind of news as like children's tales, right? That
Yeah, he
or like
calls it
myths.
fireside tales and children's stories.
Right, exactly. And I think, a possible thesis for Lord of the Rings is um that mythic tales still contain truth, whether they're children's tales or, whether they're news from your cousin or whatever. Um
Cousin Hal.
yeah, cousin Hal. And actually the chapter even begins that way, with a we're still saying goodbye to Bilbo at the beginning of the chapter. And in at the end of the first paragraph it says that um it, that the story about Mr. Baggins became a fireside story for young hobbits, and eventually Mad Baggins, who used to vanish with a bang and a flash and reappear with bags of jewels and gold, became a favorite character of legend and lived on until all the true events were forgotten. So right here we have a fireside story, but of course
Right.
that fireside story is true, right? It's
Right.
based on some truth. And even though like that story becomes legendary and Bilbo becomes kind of like a leprechaun type of character or something, um, it still is connected to something that happened and is like trying to communicate, some history or something like that. And I think so. Sam sees the value in that, even though I don't know if maybe he wouldn't be able to describe it that way, but he does value those stories as telling him something about the world, and he's kind of has this romantic heart, and he wants to believe in that stuff. And of course we find out that there are giant tree men walking through the north part of the Shire, right? Like
Right. Right.
like everyone dismisses Sam, but it's Sandyman's, supposed whatever pragmatism or
Right.
whatever that is actually wrong.
Yeah. And Sam, he has this longing
Mm,
for these stories to be true. And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that Bilbo kind of took him under his wing when he was just a wee hobbit lad. And he's sad that these changes are happening, that the world
hmm
is changing. And he talks about the elves that are moving west to the towers. And uh, even though he's never seen these towers himself,
Right.
um, and he goes into this almost like chant, this kind of mournful bit of poetry that comes out. He says, "They are sailing, sailing, sailing over the sea.
Mm.
They're going into the west and leaving us." And then it says that the rest of the hobbits laughed at him, because they just don't see the sadness of the world changing. They're blind to it.
Yeah, it's like Sam, you know, Lord of the Rings is pretty conservative about class or sort of social station.
Yeah.
Um, and even though that's true, um, Sam is kind of always breaking out of that mold, right? Like
Right.
he's a gardener, he's a farmer. Last week we talked about how his dad is a potato farmer.
Right.
So it's like literally like down in the earth. Um, but he has this more romantic view or a broader view, I guess, than you'd expect from someone of Sam's station. I don't know. Do you want to talk about how some of that kind of inside outside status maybe relates to Tolkien's life?
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
Okay.
Um, you know, I feel like Sam, in a lot of ways, is sort of a stand-in for Tolkien himself.
Mm,
Um, Tolkien's biography is in itself just a fascinating story, but his his parents died when Tolkien was very young. His father was a banker in what would later become South Africa, and he died when Tolkien was only 3 years old. And his mother and his younger brother and Tolkien moved back to England. But when they moved back to England, they did this very unpopular thing, which is to convert to Catholicism. And because of that, it really alienated the rest of her family. And
Mm.
because of that, they were very poor. They weren't uh, supported by the rest of Tolkien's family financially. And she, when Tolkien was still very young, died of diabetes. And
Mm.
Tolkien and his brother became orphans, and they fell to the care of the Catholic priest who had been friends with Tolkien's mother. His name is Father Francis. And Father Francis, pulled all sorts of strings to get Tolkien into good schools. But Tolkien's classmates were, for the most part, wealthy, and they had servants, and they had,
Right.
resources that Tolkien could only dream of. And so he always kind of had this foot in two worlds. He was himself a poor child going through these very like aristocratic educational systems, but even when he found real success as a professor, he never had the same financial means as a lot of his peers. He had to work doing odd jobs into his adulthood. Even up until the point of The Lord of the Rings being published, he had to take on extra jobs grading papers.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of famously, the first lines of The Hobbit were written on the back of a blank sheet of paper from an examination that he was grading.
I had
And
never, I had never heard that. That's an awesome detail.
yeah, he was just doing this kind of skull numbing work of just grading endless examination papers. And he says that he came to a blank page. It was like a blessed occurrence to come across a blank page. And in his boredom, he just jotted down, in a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit, even though he didn't know what a hobbit was or why he lived in a hole in the ground. And then the story grew from that. But yeah, Tolkien kind of like Sam. He has his foot in two very different worlds.
Right.
He has this academic life, but he is also like deeply interested in stories
Mm-hmm.
and myths, and that really drives his career. But he's different than the rest of his academic peers who see folklore and fairy tales as something that's the realm of children.
Mm-hmm.
But Tolkien, for his entire career, he said, these stories actually hold deep truths, and they speak to what it means to be human. I think a lot of the importance of fantasy and of fairy stories in the modern world is really due to Tolkien's academic work, and obviously the writing of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, it legitimized the genre from the jump, you know?
Yeah,
And even though there's a lot of, trashy, whatever, fantasy books out there, um, just pulp novel type of stuff, it still has like this foundation and something that's worthwhile, you
right.
know? So, Sam, he's in this argument in part because of Bilbo's influence on him, and in part, I think, because even though his job is to, be a potato farmer or whatever, a gardener, his vocation is different. He has a calling to, like, I don't know, I feel like Sam's heart is just like broken by the beauty of the world in a way.
Yeah,
He just like bears witness to like how wonderful it is that there's dwarves and elves and these stories and dragons and giant elm tree men and like I he just can't help himself, and and it's cool to like see somebody with that sort of like tension between what his job is and then what actually makes life, you know, like enchanted and worth showing up for every day. Um, anyway, yeah,
And it seems like his peers, the other rustic hobbits, they're very dismissive of Bilbo and of Frodo,
yeah,
and they say, "Oh, they're both cracked."
yeah,
Leastways,
right,
old Bilbo was cracked, and Frodo is cracking.
yeah,
And that's like an interesting way of calling them crazy.
mm-hmm.
Saying that they're insane, but uh, it's an old way of saying it. But the word crazy literally means broken, and that's like why when someone laughs, really maniacally, people will say that they cracked up. That
Right,
they're
right,
that they're like they're acting like they're insane.
mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, we know that Bilbo and Frodo aren't crazy. Bilbo saw these things with his own eyes, and
Yeah,
Frodo and Sam will soon as well. One thing that I kind of skipped over, but I think is worth kind of backtracking to, is that Frodo starts having visions and dreams.
oh yeah, I definitely wanted to touch on that too.
I think anytime that Frodo has a dream in the story, we should earmark the page, because
Yeah,
dreams are a means for the powers of the world, the powers that are greater than mortals, to communicate. And Frodo has all types of dreams throughout the story, and the myths of the powers are sort of in the background of Lord of the Rings. There's little hints. We'll hear about Elbereth in the next chapter, which is one of the Valar. And the Valar, they mean the powers, but there are these godlike angelic beings that are sort of foundational to Tolkien's mythology, and they're really only ever hinted at in the story. I think that's one of the things that is really special about Lord of the Rings. It gives it this sense of depth,
mm-hmm.
that there are these stories, that there's this framework, even though it's not usually expanded on really explicitly in the text. But it says here, he found himself wondering at times, especially in the autumn, about the wild lands, and strange visions of mountains that he had never seen came into his dreams. And I think this is a sign that Frodo is indeed special, that he is being given visions and guidance from powers that are greater than himself.
Right.
And yeah, I think we should take note of that anytime that we come across a dream that Frodo has in the text.
Yeah, and it sort of like plants like a the dream plants a yearning in his heart or a desire um to go and like actually encounter those things in the world, right?
Right.
Um
Right.
and so it's sort of it, the dream may, if it's sent by the Valar, it's kind of a way of uh, it's not exactly coercive, but it's like a suggestion or a hint that there's more out there that maybe you want to see. Um, I also think, I mean, we're told that it's in autumn, and Tolkien is good for those kind of details. When
Yeah.
exactly is it in the year? And I think that to me, like something about autumn, leaves falling off trees, um, and just the weather getting colder, the transition from summer into this like winter. It's like something being revealed in autumn. Like we have this huge ash tree in our backyard, and it drops all of its leaves in 8 hours. Like it's just like decides it's time to drop the leaves, and so it goes from being this tree, that's full of leaves, to you can like see the structure or like the skeleton, right? You like
Right.
see things more clearly in some way. Um, And it also, I think, is part of that cycle of things dying and then waiting to be kind of reborn in springs.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. That in the fullness of the trees, you can't see very far, especially like in New England where I am.
Yeah.
We're our house is kind of back in some woods, and once the leaves start falling, suddenly you can see all these things that you couldn't see before, whether it's wildlife or off into the distance. There's a clarity that comes when the trees are more naked. Um,
Yeah.
but also the autumn is when Bilbo went off on his adventure,
Right.
and fast forward several years in the story. There's a huge time jump that's about to happen, but that's when Frodo and Sam leave as well.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, so there's almost like the time of year is really important, and it's almost like the guiding hand of the powers are saying to Frodo, like, hey, at this time of year, really soon you are about to go see these far off places that you've never seen with your waking eyes, but he's given visions of them in his dreams.
Right. So, we've talked about Hobbit gossip. Sam appears to have lost the argument, even though Sandyman just speaks with an authority that he has is like based on nothing. He's like
Yeah,
wrong about everything, you know?
he's just literally wrong.
Yeah. And so Sam's like, well, I'm out of here. And makes a walk um back to I guess his house. Well, does he live with Bilbo or does he live with his dad? I
He
guess
lives with his
not
dad.
Bilbo, not Frodo. Yeah, he doesn't live with Frodo, right? Okay, so
Yeah, but
he lives at
they live on the same hill.
the same hill. That's right. Yeah,
His house is like neighbors with Frodo.
that's right. That's
It's it's made from the dirt that was taken
moved.
from the excavations that made Bag End. It's
Is that
called
true? Or are you
Yeah, it's
just
called
saying?
Bagshot Row, is what it's called, and it's basically the Hobbit hole that they live in is made from the dirt from the tunneling at Bag End.
Wow, that's an interesting detail.
But they
Okay,
basically live on the same complex, like he's
yeah,
a live in gardener. But yeah, he lives with his old dad.
gotcha.
Yeah,
Um, so Gandalf, we're told just at this time. So just at the same time as Sam is walking home from the bar, Gandalf reappears. And
after
yeah,
many years of being
it's
gone.
been a long time. It's been yeah, a, a while. And he says, "Well, we're told, let me see here.
So he shows up
Um
3 years after the party, but he kind of just pops in at night.
he takes a good look at him. He
Yeah, and then
just
he's whoosh, off again.
right. It's like you're not like see-through yet, are you? Okay, cool. So,
Okay, okay, good. You're not
yeah.
saying my precious and coughing from
Right.
your throat, saying
Yeah,
Gollum all the time. So
exactly. But then it's 9 years since Frodo hears from him.
yeah,
Um,
and doing a little bit of math, it says that 50 kind of creeps up on
yeah,
Frodo,
right.
and he was 33 during the long expected party, so that makes it 17 years jumped. Which ironically, and I don't think this is an inside joke. I just think it's an interesting coincidence.
Hmm.
17 years is the same gap of time in the real world between the publication of The Hobbit and the publication of the Fellowship of the Ring,
Oh, yeah. Okay.
1937 to 1954. So the time that Gandalf is off doing all this ring research and reconnaissance is 17 years, and that's how long it took Tolkien in the real world to write the Lord of the Rings. Um, so I don't know if that's an inside joke that Tolkien wrote in there or if it's just a coincidence. But yeah, Gandalf shows up 17 years later, and he comes in and he's like, "All well, eh? You look the same as ever, Frodo." And says,
Hmm.
"So do you." But secretly, he thought that Gandalf looked older and more careworn.
Yeah.
So he's polite, being like, "Oh yeah, you look the same too, old friend Gandalf." But
Hmm.
uh, I guess his eyebrows are a little bushier and he's a little more gnarled and
Yeah,
bent over.
he hasn't been keeping up on his moisturizing routine um, out there in
You
the
texted me
world.
the other day that you found out that Gandalf was only 5'6"
Well, that's what it
or
says
something
in the
along those lines.
that's what it says in like the Lord of the Rings wiki. I mean, I don't know if that's actually real, but he's always depicted as like 6'4", you know.
Yeah, yeah. Gandalf, the short king.
Which I guess he's, very tall compared to the hobbits, but
Right.
so, he says you look the same as ever, which is a polite, thing to say, but of course Frodo does look the same as ever. Um and then we get into this well, first it's funny. First they go to bed and eat a late breakfast because I think they were up all night chatting. And then in the morning they get into this ring lore section where Frodo asks Gandalf, you say that the ring is dangerous, and Gandalf starts to kind of let him know how dangerous it actually is. In
Yeah,
fact,
he's like, last night you started talking about some stuff about my
yeah,
ring, but you said that it really should wait till the light of day.
right,
I thought it was interesting that he calls it my ring.
right,
Um, uh,
not Bilbo's ring,
Not Bilbo's ring. And I was thinking about it, like if I had a ring that was like from my father, that was passed down to me, I think it would be more common for someone to say like, "Oh, my dad's ring," or
yeah,
Bilbo's ring. Later, he calls it our ring, but I do think this is like kind of a sign that it's starting to take hold of him. He's starting to think of it as something that he possesses himself.
yep, yep. So Gandalf says it's dangerous in many ways, far more powerful than I ever dared to think at first. So powerful that in the end it would utterly overcome anyone of mortal race who possessed it. It would possess him. And he sort of goes on. He talks about how someone who keeps the ring doesn't die, um, uh, but he does not grow or obtain more life. He merely continues until at last every minute is a weariness. So we start to understand some of the effects that the ring has on a person who possesses it.
Yeah, and we saw a little bit of this in the first chapter where Bilbo talks about being stretched like
Right.
butter scraped over too much bread. And it's a symbol, is a sign that this is a great ring. And we get some of the lore kind of just like really quickly here that the elves in Eregion long ago made loads of rings, just tons of magic
Mm,
rings, but there were some that were lesser and then there were some that were great. And there were
right.
only very few great rings that were made. But the fact that both Bilbo and Frodo have this prolonged youth or a
Hmm.
seeming youth is a sign that this is one of the great rings. But
Right.
Gandalf, he has this sense like from the very beginning that this is a great ring, not just one of the lesser rings. And it says that if someone uses the ring to make himself invisible over time, he'll fade and eventually he'll become permanently invisible and walk in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the ring.
Yeah.
There's kind of an interesting kind of retcon that happens here. It's very subtle, but um, Gandalf talks about how from the very beginning, Bilbo
Mm,
told these really subtle lies about how he came into possession of the ring, and that Bilbo needed to assert that he came about the ring in an honest way, that it wasn't stolen or that it really was his, that he possessed it legitimately. And Gandalf is concerned about this, and eventually he gets the quote unquote true story out of Bilbo about how he came across the ring, that he essentially stole it from
yeah.
Gollum, that he came about it in a kind of a dishonest way, but he needs to frame the story in a way that he received it legitimately. And the retcon is that the original edition of The Hobbit that was published in 1937 had a very different version of the riddle game that is very famous.
Mm-hmm.
And in the original version of The Hobbit that most people would have read before they read this this new book, in that original edition, the stakes of the riddle game is that if Bilbo wins, Gollum will give him a present, and that the present is itself the ring.
Mm-hmm.
But as the story grew, Tolkien realized that doesn't match this new story that he's telling. Gollum would never give up the ring. In fact, later on, when Gandalf is talking to Frodo, he says that Bilbo is the only person in history who has ever willingly given up the ring. And so before the Fellowship of the Ring was published, Tolkien put out a new edition of The Hobbit, and that's The Hobbit that anyone who's listening to this podcast has surely read, because all editions afterward had a new version of the riddle game where the stakes are changed, where it's not that Gollum will give the ring to Frodo if he wins, or to Bilbo rather, if he wins. But instead it's like, if you lose, I'll eat you. But if you win, I'll show you the way out. Right. Which is very different. And you can find the original version online, where you can see like a side by side, and you can see all the things that were added into this next edition. But it serves two purposes. One, it shows in the news story, it shows that Bilbo, from the very beginning of coming into possession of the ring, had to create this alternative story that he told himself to legitimize his ownership of it. And that's very concerning to Gandalf, because he knows who Bilbo is. He's not a liar.
Yeah.
He's not someone who would like knowingly misrepresent the truth. And so that sets a kind of an alarm bell off in Gandalf's mind. But it also serves to correct the story that was floating around at the time that this book was published. So it kind of creates an in-universe reason for why there are two different stories of how Bilbo came across the ring.
Yeah, I love that, and I love, the sort of layers, right, of the actual publication of The Hobbit, this retcon publication, the story that we have here of Gandalf sort of explaining why there's another story out there, plus the idea that Bilbo is an author of this text, as is Frodo, as is Sam, right?
Right.
And so there is a Bilbo text, right? Like the B editor, right?
Right.
The ones by Frodo have the correction because Gandalf tells him here that it needs to be corrected. So I love that.
Up in the Council of Elrond, in 6 years or however long it takes us to get there. No, it'll come up faster than we know. But they talk at length about the fact that the story that anybody at the council had heard is not actually the correct story, and Gandalf gives the corrected version of how Bilbo came across the ring.
But I love this sort of postmodern thing of like, I mean, it feels very postmodern to me, actually, of the fictional world spilling into the actual world, and vice versa, like through this like textual editing.
It's that, Tolkien is not the creator of the story in this like kind of constructed world of the text. He's just a translator who found these like ancient texts and translated them into modern English, but that the actual authors are themselves Frodo and Sam, and originally Bilbo, and in the first chapter, this is something we didn't talk about in episode 1, Bilbo says to Gandalf essentially like, I'm excited to go off and finish my book.
Yeah.
And Gandalf kind of laughs and says, so I wonder who will read it. And the irony there is that, we are reading this story. Mm-hmm. And, that's what Tolkien did in his professional life. Like he translated texts like Beowulf and, kind of brought them into the modern world through his English translations. Right. And, there's just an irony there. I think it's a little inside joke that Tolkien's kind of laughing at himself in that phrase, because he spent so long writing this book and he never had any dream that it would become the phenomenon that it did. And
Right.
he was kind of like, oh, nobody's really going to read this. Um, but yeah, the irony of the fact that now it's like, one of the most successful books of all time,
Yeah.
just beloved
Amazing.
by millions. But Tolkien never dreamed that that would actually ever happen. Just like Bilbo didn't think that anybody would ever actually read his story.
Yeah.
So yeah, we find out that Gandalf has been spending all this time studying the history of the rings, that he has kind of pieced together this timeline for how the ring came to Bilbo and then to Frodo. And we find out that this is indeed the one ring, the one ring to rule them all. And the final proof that he gets, is by asking Frodo to lend him the ring, and then to Frodo's horror, he throws it into the fire.
Yeah. It's like, what are you doing?
Yeah, in his horror, we can already see that like Frodo would never do anything to harm the ring. It's already starting
Right.
to grow an importance in his mind.
Yeah.
But Gandalf throws the ring into the fire, and after a little while, he closes the shutters, and the room goes dark, and he pulls the ring out, and he puts it into Frodo's shrinking hand, because he's expecting it to be hot.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. He says it's quite cool. And he says, what do you see? Look closely. And it says that Frodo looks and he sees uh, fine lines, finer than the finest pen strokes, running along the ring, outside and inside, lines of fire that seemed to form the letters of a flowing script. They
Mm.
shone piercingly bright and yet remote, as if out of a great depth. And we get the beautiful calligraphy that Tolkien himself wrote, in the script. And Frodo says, I can't read it. And
Yeah.
Gandalf says, no, but I can.
Right.
The letters are elvish of an ancient mode, but the language is that of Mordor, which I will not utter here. But this, in the common tongue, is what is said close enough. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them.
Mm.
And so that's the final proof, that Gandalf needed, even though he was already certain,
Right.
that this is the master ring, the one ring to rule them all.
Right. The Master Ring, yeah. The one ring that he lost many ages ago. To the great weakening of his power, he greatly desires it, but he must not get it. So we get stakes there. We really understand how dangerous it is. And then Frodo says, "This ring?" It's like the ring that I've been holding in my pocket all these years, Bilbo's ring,
How on earth did it come to me?
he can't believe it. He's like, the ring, this ring? It's so funny.
This one that I'm holding in my hand?
Yeah. He
Yeah.
just can't believe it. And then, yeah, he's like, well, how the hell did it get to me? Like, I don't understand how this happened,
And we get like, the rest of the poem, which I won't read the whole poem. I think a lot of people, if they're really into Lord of the Rings like me,
Mm.
probably memorized this poem as a child.
Yeah,
But
right.
you get the kind of the rest of the history of the rings, where there were 3 that were made for the elves, but the
Mm-hmm.
Dark Lord never touched them. So they're sort of untainted by his evil. And then you get 7 for the dwarves, who used those rings to amass great power, but those were directly influenced by the Dark Lord himself.
Right.
And then 9 are given to mortal men who desire power above all else. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, those will eventually be revealed to be the ring wraiths, the Nazgul, the Black Riders.
Yeah.
And we find out this sort of like complex history of how the ring came to Frodo, through this kind of like winding, long, you know, millennia long road. And we find out that, you know, the Dark Lord secretly made this one ring to control all the other bearers of these great rings, but that he lost it because of the efforts of the powerful and the wise. You know, this last alliance of men who are from Westerness, from Numenor, this like kind of Atlantis like, technologically advanced, you know, powerful men who joined with the wise, the elves, to overthrow the Dark Lord. And the greatest of these warriors are Gil-galad, who is the king of the elves, the High King, Elendil, who was one of these refugees from the downfall of Numenor, who came to Middle Earth with his sons. In that Gil-galad, Elendil, and Elendil's son Anarion threw down the Dark Lord, but they died in the process of throwing him down. And Elendil's other son, Isildur, cuts the ring from the fallen Dark Lord's finger,
Right.
using the shards of his father's broken sword, Narsil. And, you know, Narsil and the shards of Narsil will get reintroduced back into the story through Aragorn. But yeah, he cuts the ring off the Dark Lord's finger, and instead of destroying it at the cracks of doom in that moment, instead he takes it as an heirloom of his house.
That's what he says. I take it as an heirloom of my house, right?
Right. And in other parts of the story and in other sort of like supplemental texts, he refers to it as a weregild for his brother and his father. And a weregild is a price that's paid by a soldier who kills another soldier in battle, and it's given to the family of the fallen soldier as essentially like a life insurance policy. It's like, you know, you have lost this pillar of your family, and so I'm going to give you some sort of compensation for the death of this family member. And so he takes it as a weregild, as a price for the death of these two great men and his family. And you know, in the movies, Isildur is sort of cast in this villainous light, but he's a much more complex character than I think, and it was probably just necessary in the films to really quickly.
They're just going for a mood, you know, like this was a real tragedy kind of thing. So he kind of has to look sort of sketchy, I think, but I don't think he's necessarily a sketchy guy.
No, and he's definitely not an evil guy.
Right.
But, you know, he takes the ring, and while he's on the road going up to the part of the world that the Shire is in, he's waylaid by a pack of orcs. You know, he puts the ring on his finger to escape the orcs, but he's shot and he falls into the river, and the ring slips from his finger and is lost to history for, you know, millennia.
Yeah.
Until, you know, we find out from Gandalf that it's found by chance by these little hobbit-like people.
Right.
And that's how we're introduced to the characters of Smeagol and Deagle.
Right. I want to scroll back real quick, just to the point of, you know, taking the ring as an heirloom of your house and claiming that, you know, the ring was my birthday present are not that different.
Right.
And so it's pretty close to a birthday present. It's pretty close to saying, oh, I won it in a, you know, in a
legitimate contest.
Yeah, legitimate contest in a riddle contest, right? Right. And so whatever character comes to possess the ring or desires to possess the ring, they express their ownership of it in whatever way kind of reflects who they see themselves as. And we'll,
Right.
we'll get into this later, I think, but the ring is kind of like an ego enhancer. Um,
Right.
and so it enhances those parts of your personality that, you know, that you sort of see as like operative or something like that.
Right.
And so, for a great lord, I take it as a weregild or as an heirloom of my house. And, if you're a little freak like Smeagol, then you take it as a birthday, you take it as a birthday present. So
Yeah. And Smeagol is a little freak, man. I mean,
he really
it
is.
says that he's kind of sneaky from the beginning. It says that he's like he likes roots and beginnings, and he's already kind of sneaky. But
Yeah.
um, he lives with his grandma,
Mm-hmm.
on the banks of this river in this like kind of primitive hobbit dwelling.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got this buddy Deagle who's out fishing and gets pulled into the river by this fish that's like bigger than he could reel in, and it pulls him down, and he grabs a handful of mud, and he comes up, and then in his hand he sees this perfect, beautiful golden ring.
Right.
And Smeagol, the moment he lays eyes on this thing, he wants it. And he says essentially like, give it to me, it's my birthday. And Deagle
Yes.
says, I already gave you a birthday present, and it was more than I could afford.
Yeah.
And Deagle says, I'm not going to give you the ring. And so Smeagol just offs the guy. He just strangles him to death.
It's just, murders him on the spot.
On site,
Yeah.
he strangles Deagle, hides his body, and then when he goes back to town, he realizes that nobody can see him.
Yeah.
And so he's like, great. This is a opportunity for me to get into all kinds of spying and trouble. And people start to hate him for it. They realize like that he's like sneaking around. And so his grandmother casts him out of the community, which is something I didn't realize until I reread this chapter this morning. This grandmother figure to rid the community of this menace just casts him out.
Yeah.
And that's how he finds his way into the Misty Mountains. He starts to become wary of the light of the sun and of the moon. Right. And he thinks like, oh, the mountains, I bet you there's lots of deep, dark, cool places that I could get into there. And so he goes off into the mountains, and he himself is lost to time. And for a few hundred years, he just becomes more and more obsessed with the ring. It possesses him more and more acutely until he becomes completely possessed by it and becomes this murderous, sneaky, solitary creature. And that's where Bilbo comes across him in The Hobbit.
I think before we get to Bilbo and sort of the interaction that happens there, we should draw a comparison between Smeagol's first encounter with the ring and Frodo's first encounter with the knowledge of what the ring is. And because Frodo, even though the ring is growing in his mind, he still has an orientation. He says, I wish it need not have happened in my time. Yeah. This is such a this chapter is just full of like one-liners,
great lines
that are awesome. And he says, yeah, I wish it need not have happened in my time. And Gandalf says, so do all who live to see such times. But that's not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And then he says, and already, Frodo, our time is beginning to look black. The enemy is fast becoming very strong. His plans are far from ripe, I think, but they are ripening. We should be very hard put to it, even if it were not for this dreadful chance. And, that is, I think, addressing the reader to some degree.
Right.
The idea that we have choices to interact with the world and with our neighbors in ways that we can easily ignore. Yeah, again, I'm thinking of the tension between, the Samwises of the world and the Sandymans of the world. And so that piece is there. And the other thing is that even though we're given this chance, it's a dreadful chance. It's a chance that anyone would reject, I think.
Well, I think that Frodo is actually pretty unique in the fact that he essentially says, like, I don't want this.
Yeah.
Almost everybody else that we encounter in the book, with very few exceptions, it's almost like a litmus test for character that,
Yeah.
if you really want the ring, that's a sign that you really shouldn't have it.
Even Gandalf says, I could really use it. I've got trials
I
ahead
shall
of me.
have such need of it.
Yeah, I got
says.
trials ahead of me, and I could really use it. And Frodo's like, I don't want anything to do with this if I can help it.
And Frodo offers the ring to Gandalf.
Yeah.
As far as I could tell and recall, he offers the ring to two people in the story. He offers it to Gandalf, and he offers it to Galadriel.
Yeah.
And the marker of the wisdom of those two characters is that they realize that if they were given the ring, if they possessed it, that the ring would ultimately possess them, and that out of a desire to do good, evil would come from it. But I do think it's interesting that Gandalf says, Frodo says essentially, like, you take it, and Gandalf says, don't tempt me. And I think it's worth noting that the fact that he says don't tempt me shows that some part of him does desire it. You can't be tempted by something that you don't want.
Right.
Like I hate yellow mustard, and so I'm never tempted to try to eat yellow mustard.
What?
I know. Ugh,
I'm just learning this about you now. This is a terrible news.
Oh,
we have to stop doing this now.
We can't be friends if you like yellow mustard.
I guess we should finish recording this episode, but man,
it's a sticky point between me and my wife that my wife loves honey mustard, and I'm just so repulsed by it. But
well, she's a smart lady.
I'm never tempted by it. I'm never tempted by something that I don't want. And the fact that Gandalf says, like, I should have such need of it before the end shows that that there's something about him that does want this power to affect other people's wills, to change the course of history through this coercive means. But his wisdom is realizing that by taking it out of a desire to do good, greater evil would come from it. There would be a continuation of this evil. And so the wise realize that rather than taking the ring and using it for good intentions and using it as a means to an end, that it's actually their responsibility to destroy it. One thing that will come up again and again in reading this story is that Tolkien's philosophy is that an idea of using a means to an end is never the noble, wise, or correct thing to do.
Right.
That the good characters in the story will invariably choose to do something that is hard or difficult rather than something that's easy. A means to an end is never acceptable in Tolkien's philosophy.
Right.
And so that's why Gandalf says, don't give me the ring. We have to destroy it. And the only way that we can destroy it is to throw it into the Cracks of Doom, which is such a great name.
Yeah, it is awesome. The Cracks of Doom is fantastic.
Frodo, courageously says, I'll get it out of the Shire. He doesn't offer to go all the way to the Cracks of Doom. I don't think he has that kind of inflated view of his own capabilities.
Yeah.
But he says, it has to get out of the Shire because, Gollum, we find out, was, he left the Misty Mountains to seek after Baggins. He kind of hung around Dale and, found rumors about where Baggins lived. He finds out that he lives in the Shire. And so he goes to find the ring and reclaim it. But in the meantime, he is picked up by the agents of the Dark Lord and is
Right.
tortured. And through that torture, the Dark Lord finds out that the ring is with this creature in this place called the Shire, and his name is Baggins.
Yeah. Hears about hobbits for the first time, probably.
Yeah, yeah, they're
Right.
little known, but because of this, Gandalf realizes like, hey, this thing cannot stay here. Time
Right.
is ticking. Inevitably, the agents of the enemy are going to make their way into the Shire and turn them all to slaves. And if he reclaims this ring, that's it. He'll cover the world in a second darkness, he says.
Yeah.
And that is something they have to avoid. And so Frodo really courageously says, I'll take it out of the Shire. I don't know where to, but there's just kind of this like kind of harebrained plan to, get it out of the Shire, and Frodo's going to go to Rivendell, and then they're going to figure out what to do next.
Right. Yeah. I love how multifaceted, these characters are right from the beginning. Frodo, has this reaction where like, I don't want the ring. I'm willing to give it up. Please, somebody else take it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, he also is like totally disgusted by Smeagol. Like he's only heard horrible stories about Smeagol. Now he's even more disgusted. He's just repulsed by Smeagol, and he says, "I wish Bilbo had stabbed him when he had the chance. Why didn't Bilbo just take care of him then?"
Yeah,
Like
he's worse than an orc.
yeah, Smeagol is like has like this huge stature in Frodo's mind, and even as upset as he is about the ring, it's focused on Smeagol, and he's like, I wish that he had stabbed him. And you were saying that when the wise are tempted by, to use something for an end, or a person, as an end, or as a means to an end, sorry,
Right.
that's not strictly good or ethical, they don't do it. And I think we have that here, that, it was a pity that 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 Bilbo didn't stab Smeagol, and Gandalf says it's pity that stayed his hand. And then,
Yeah, I
and
think
then
that's worth reading. I think that's worth reading that section of the text. He says, "What a pity that Bilbo did not stab the vile creature when he had the chance." And Gandalf says, "Pity. It was pity that stayed his hand.
mm-hmm.
Pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so,
Mm-hmm.
with pity." Frodo, he is a noble character, but I think we get a little insight into the fact that he's a person, with faults, just like us. And his response is probably the same response that the reader would have, which is just like, why didn't they just off this guy when they had the chance?
Yeah.
But Gandalf like corrects Frodo and says, you know, don't be so quick to deal out death in judgment, because there are some that live that deserve to die, but there are some that die that deserve to live, and you can't give life to those who have died.
Right.
You have the power to kill, but you don't have the power to revive. And so, you have to wield that power with responsibility and with grace. And in the story, anytime that an evil character is met in a moment of powerlessness, when they're held in judgment by one of the good characters, they're given a second chance without fail.
Yeah.
You know, Saruman is given a chance to repent, even though he doesn't take it.
Mm-hmm.
Wormtongue is given a chance to repent.
Right.
Gandalf says, you've been deep in the enemy's council. You have an opportunity to take your evil actions and turn them to the good. And Wormtongue doesn't take the chance for repentance either.
Right.
But nobody is ever not given a chance to repent. And Gandalf says to Frodo, I think it's a sad story.
Yeah, it's
And I,
such so
and,
beautiful.
and I think it's interesting that Gandalf calls him Smeagol and not Gollum.
Yeah,
He chooses
humanizes
to
him.
see he chooses to see the good in him, even though he's done all these terrible,
Yeah,
evil things.
he even says Gollum was not wholly ruined.
No,
He had proved tougher than even the wise would have guessed, as a hobbit might. Hobbits are just tough little dudes, and Gollum, yeah, he's got a bad start, but there's we see later that through Frodo's mercy toward him, or his acceptance of Smeagol, that it sort of is edifying, like it's upbuilding in Gollum, like that
yeah,
Smeagol essence or whatever gets built up by Frodo's goodness toward him. Um,
yeah,
Even though ultimately he meets a pretty grisly end in the fire, but it's
spoiler alert.
yeah, spoiler alert for this 70-year-old book. I I I think that that idea that like evil will meet its own end if good people stick to the good and don't try to use the methods of evil to combat it.
Yeah,
Um, there's a sense of like you don't foreclose the possibility of the future by making a choice now that's irrevocable.
yeah,
Um, and you don't just decide cynically that there's no hope. Because the future is both open in a sense and also sort of like
yeah,
um, fated to arrive in a certain place.
yeah. And that really goes against modern sensibilities. Like,
Oh yeah,
we don't like to think of our futures as being written or a fate existing, but there's a
yeah,
real subtlety to the philosophy that is really, I think, built on Tolkien's own Catholic theology,
absolutely.
which is that these two things are held in tension. That yes, there's fate. Yes, there are these powers that subtly guide your actions, but
Hmm.
that doesn't take away your personal responsibility to act nobly at all times.
Yeah,
You're simultaneously, the fate exists, but also personal responsibility is of utmost importance. And Gandalf says, I sense that he will have a part to play before the end, and that
right.
the pity of Bilbo may be the salvation of us all. And that's Gandalf's wisdom. And he has this insight, and ultimately we find out through the end of the story that Bilbo's pity and Frodo's pity and their mercy is ultimately what leads to the success of the entire quest.
Hmm.
Without allowing Smeagol to live and play his part, um, the entire quest would have been doomed.
Right.
And so that's Gandalf's wisdom, and I think it's something that Frodo learns from Gandalf and pays off in the end.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that I mean I just think it's so interesting, that God, there's just so much happening in these interactions in just a few words where, we're talking about fate and I think you're right that, that modern sensibility is pretty allergic. I think I'm allergic to that. I'm like, real, I mean,
Yeah,
I don't, am I part of some narrative, isn't
I'm the
free
captain of
will.
my ship.
Yeah, isn't free will sort of operative or whatever, um but I actually think even though I'm, a modern person who is, skeptical of that, I still think the story is really good that way. Like this,
Yeah,
I'm talking about, this story.
we
Um,
want this to be true. Yeah,
it's really good this way. And like there's a sense that like without free will, there's no meaning or something like that. But like the end of every novel you've ever read is predetermined.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so like the fact that I think that actually reflects something about life potentially, that
Yeah.
because the way we tell stories have these like predetermined ends, it doesn't make the end less meaningful. I actually think it's more meaningful because it's headed towards some kind of like, telos or whatever, like an end. And
And I think
and
that's why we tell these stories.
right, and,
Like,
and we're like dominated by, post enlightenment individualistic agency and pessimism and self determination. And like you would think that like having all this agency and self determination would give us some like hope, but it
yeah,
it sort of operates the it sort of operates the opposite way, I think.
yeah, mm,
So we have a hard time kind of accepting like I'm part of a story that's bigger than me, but I still have this freedom within it to make choices. And like the choices that I make have ultimate significance for me, but it doesn't have ultimate significance for the world. And so even within this story, like the Lord of the Rings, we're in the second chapter. If Frodo's like, no, like peace, I'm out. Eventually, the ring, I think, still finds its way to the cracks of doom.
yeah,
Um, at some point in the future, and I'm talking about like there's like an eternal arc. You know what I mean?
yeah,
And so
absolutely.
Frodo makes the right choice, but he doesn't make the ultimate choice for the story of the ring,
Right.
necessarily. And I think ultimately, hope is the thing that Tolkien always falls back to.
Yeah.
My friend Ben says that hope is a weapon,
Mm,
um, and I think the ultimate weapon in Lord of the Rings is hope. But when
absolutely.
you reach for those other weapons that we were talking about before, different, we reach for means to an end, that the end is good, but the means are bad.
Right.
Certainty, power, control. That's how you end up like Saruman.
Yeah.
Um, and so, Gandalf's um Gandalf's response to Frodo when he says, "I wish it like why did it come to me?" is to say, "I don't know. I will
Yeah.
help you bear this burden."
Right.
So Gandalf always chooses tenderness, encouragement, and ultimately
Yeah.
hope as the sort of bulwark against.
Those are his weapons. Those are his tools that he
Yeah,
uses
absolutely.
to guide and to bolster. But I think that Tolkien had this philosophy that the purpose of stories is to give people hope, is to give
Mm-hmm.
people a happy ending. And I
Yeah,
think it's interesting that in the first chapter, when Bilbo is talking about finishing his book, one of the last things that he says to Gandalf is, I already thought of an ending,
yeah,
and he will live happily ever after to the end of his days.
yeah,
He's already written the ending of his story before his story is finished. And I think that speaks to Tolkien's optimism
right.
that, that things will work out in the end, and that it's the responsibility of storytellers to give people the hope that things will eventually work out.
Yeah,
And I think it invites us to, as readers, to meet the challenges in our lives, to think like, if I was in Frodo's position, which is far more dire than any circumstance that I could ever be in, you know would I rise to the challenge in the same way that Frodo is here? It inspires you to say like, okay, whatever I'm going through in my life, I too have a choice to rise to the occasion with courage and with the hope that all things will work out. And I may not see how the end is going to come, but ultimately I know that the ending will work out for truth and for goodness.
yeah.
And yeah, I think that's a really inspiring thing.
I think it's possible if Tolkien was like here, on the call with us, he would say, "Guys, it's just supposed to be an exciting story." Like
Yeah, no, I don't buy
I,
that.
I, I feel like I read that he even said that to people who would write in with fan mail and stuff like that.
Yeah,
But, um,
yeah. There's a great in his letters, which is the book is right behind me. Somebody asked about the deeper meaning of Lord of the Rings, and
yeah,
he said, I really just set out to write an exciting story.
yeah,
and he was always really hesitant to. Everybody who wrote wanted to know, what is Lord of the Rings an allegory for? And he was really
Right.
allergic to the idea that it was an allegory, and he really challenged people to say it's not an allegory for modern times.
Right.
There's not a one-to-one comparison of like, the ring is atomic, nuclear weapons, or Sauron is Hitler, or whatever else people really wanted the story to be. But he said, there's not allegory in the story, but there is applicability. The purpose of stories is to be able to apply them to your life, and
Right.
to apply them to situations, and to be inspired by them. Tolkien definitely had a goal in writing this long sweeping story, and I think that goal was to inspire people to have the same courage.
Right. And I think that, it's not an allegory, but I think you know, the text, every text reads the world as well
Yeah,
as us reading the text. And so when someone finds a nuclear weapon in the text, it's because the ring reads the nuclear weapon into the text.
right.
Uh, this is like, you know, pretty technical, like hermeneutical stuff, but I really believe that. I think we can say the ring is a nuclear weapon, and also at the same time say Tolkien did not intend this as a nuclear weapon, right?
Right.
Uh, it's a way of reading text that I think we can find the deeper meaning that's there because the meaning comes out of our own lives, and I think that's a great way to read fiction, um, just in general. And I would also say, if it was just an exciting story, you probably wouldn't write an entire chapter with no plot, right?
several
like, like,
chapters with.
like there is no plot in this chapter. It's just bangers. Like it's
Yeah,
just like the lines are lines that you can tell he spent time on, or that
absolutely.
he, had occurred to him. He's like, I got to put this into the world somehow. And if people are going to pay attention to it, it has to be part of an exciting story.
Yeah.
So, even though this chapter has no plot, we're getting to some plot. And I know that people bounce off these first few chapters because they're like, I don't know about these elves
Come
and
on.
dwarves, and no one's doing anything. And I thought there was going to be swords. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
instead, we're just talking about hope. But
Yeah. It takes a lot of
uh,
patience.
it does take patience, and it's sort of like a hackneyed thing now where it's like, well, you really like the show, but you have to watch the first 6 episodes first. Like it
Yeah.
really gets good, it
Yep.
really gets good like after about 6 hours, and you're like, I don't have 6 hours to spend on something getting good. Um, but this is the best selling book next to the Bible, so like, give it a chance. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah. Just trust that it's really good.
yeah,
But yeah, I think the patience that he has in telling the story,
yeah,
I think it really pays dividends later. And the kind of meandering road that the hobbits take to get to Rivendell before the story really ever truly kicks off. Um, it's that time that we spend in the Shire that makes us fall in love with the Shire, and it sets
yeah,
the stakes. We realize that the Shire is something that's beautiful, and for
right,
all of its faults, it is something that's worth protecting. And it you know everybody just loves the Shire. They think like, oh, like I want to live there. That's
yeah, right,
like, let me live in like this in this verdant paradise. But you we get to see some of its warts in the way that he starts to tell the story, but we also deeply fall in love with it ourselves. And if he just kicked off the story right away,
mm-hmm.
we wouldn't have that deep love for the land that Frodo and Sam are ultimately fighting for.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I
And
think.
there are exciting things happening inside this house at Bag End.
Yeah.
On one level, it's just two people talking to each other and kind of giving a bunch of exposition and a history lesson. But at the same time, like, there's as much, like, Frodo has been chosen. The ring has come to him. Bilbo gave it up, right? Bilbo giving it up is like a world historical event.
Only time it's ever happened.
It coming to Frodo is like this unfortunate thing for Frodo, but like, momentum is starting right now. Like there are choices being made between Frodo and Gandalf that represent as much momentum in small ways inside Bag End. There's as much being set in motion here as there is outside the Shire with orcs and trolls and the forces of, of Sauron, of Mordor, kind of starting to spill out into the world. But it's secret, right?
Yeah.
So like it's not as if there's nothing happening. This is the thing that is gonna it's gonna. There's almost like there's more space inside Bag End than there is outside Bag End because it's so momentous what is happening right now. The resolution of Frodo and Gandalf to do something about it is a big thing. It's a small seed, but it has a big effect. So, yeah,
And you and I are not the only ones who are excited about these developments because the clicking of Sam's shears are getting closer and closer
right.
to the window.
It says that Gandalf fishes him out from the window. I love that kind of like he sort of like hooks him or something, and then pulls him into the
grabs him by his furry head.
Yeah.
And he says, why have you been eavesdropping? And Sam has that great line where he says, oh, Lord bless me, Gandalf, but there aren't any eaves at Bag End, and
right.
Sam kind of recounts the story in this kind of like almost childish way of the things that he's heard. Gandalf says, don't be a fool. What have you heard and why did you listen? And he says, Mr. Frodo, sir, said Sam, don't let him hurt me, sir. Don't let him turn me into anything unnatural. My old dad would take on so. I meant no harm, on my honor, sir. And
so sweet.
And Gandalf rewards his eavesdropping with a chance to join this quest with Frodo. And Sam gets to do what he's always wanted to do, which he's going to go off and see elves.
Yeah, me go and see elves and all. Hooray! Then he bursts into tears.
He says, me, sir, springing up like a dog invited for a walk.
Yes, the dog.
Me go and see elves and all. Hooray! He shouted and then burst into tears.
That's so funny.
That's how the chapter ends.
Completely overwhelmed. It's beautiful.
So yeah, that was a fun reading this chapter with you, and
absolutely.
Next week the quest really begins in earnest, and we hit the road.
Thank you for reading along with us. Please join us next week for Chapter 3. 3 is Company. If you want to help us out, share this podcast with a Lord of the Rings fan in your life. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and visit waywardwizards.com for more info. May the hair on your toes never fall out. We'll see you next week.